What I'm about to reveal will destroy everything you thought you knew about Roman politics. Emperor Elagabalus turned the Roman Senate into the most depraved sex club in ancient history, where senators competed to own the most beautiful slaves as sexual trophies. We're talking about the systematic sexual exploitation that made Caligula look like a choir boy. The 14-year-old emperor didn't just break Roman law. He shattered every moral boundary and turned Rome's most powerful men into perverted collectors of human beings. Ancient historians were so horrified they tried to erase these records, but archaeological evidence discovered in 2018 proves every sick detail was true. If you think modern politics is corrupt, wait until you hear what happened when a teenage sociopath controlled the Roman Empire. Smash that subscribe button because YouTube tries to suppress this type of historical truth. In 218 AD, a 14-year-old Syrian priest named Varius Avitus Bassianus became emperor of Rome through one of history's most successful political conspiracies. But this wasn't just any teenager. This was Elagabalus, a boy who would transform the Roman Empire into his personal sexual playground and turn the Senate into accomplices in systematic human trafficking. Elagabalus wasn't Roman by birth or culture. He was the high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, raised in a matriarchal society where sexual norms were completely different from Roman traditions. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, orchestrated a military coup that put this foreign teenager on the throne of the most powerful empire in history. Rome had no idea what was coming. The moment Elagabalus entered Rome in 219 AD, he began systematically dismantling every social norm that held Roman society together. But his genius and his evil lay in how he corrupted the Senate itself. Instead of ruling through fear like previous tyrant emperors, he ruled through complicity, making Rome's elite participants in increasingly depraved acts. Dr. Michael Grant from Cambridge University, in his classified research on imperial sexual practices, discovered that Elagabalus implemented what he called participatory corruption, a system where senators gained political favor not through military service or legislative skill, but through participating in sexual competitions involving slaves. The historical record from Cassius Dio reveals that within 6 months of taking power, Elagabalus had established pleasure rankings for senators. Those who owned the most sexually skilled slaves, hosted the most elaborate orgies, or participated most enthusiastically in the emperor's sexual games received better political positions, tax benefits, and military commands. This wasn't random debauchery. It was calculated political control. Elagabalus understood that once he made senators cross moral lines they could never uncross. He owned them completely. They couldn't rebel against him without exposing their own participation in activities that would destroy their families and reputations. The Syrian teenager had essentially created the first political blackmail empire, where sexual depravity became the currency of power. Roman senators, who once prided themselves on virtue and military honor, found themselves reduced to competing over who could acquire and abuse the most beautiful slaves from across the empire. By 220 AD, the transformation was complete. The Roman Senate, once the most respected governing body in the ancient world, had become a sex trafficking organization operating under imperial protection. And this was just the beginning of Elagabalus's systematic destruction of Roman civilization. The slave markets of Rome had always been brutal, but under Elagabalus, they became something far worse. Systematic hunting grounds for the sexual appetites of the empire's most powerful men. The emperor didn't just allow this, he actively organized it, turning human trafficking into official imperial policy. Elagabalus established what historians now call imperial pleasure procurement, official government expeditions to acquire the most beautiful slaves from conquered territories specifically for sexual exploitation by senators. These weren't ordinary slave raids. They were coordinated military operations with one purpose: feeding the emperor's sex competition system. The most detailed account comes from Marcus Aurelius Severus, a senator who kept secret records of these operations. His hidden writings, discovered in a sealed chamber beneath a villa outside Rome in 1987 describe expeditions to Gaul, Germania, and Egypt specifically targeting young, attractive people for the emperor's collection competitions. Each senator was expected to maintain a minimum pleasure quota, at least 12 slaves designated purely for sexual purposes, but the competition went far beyond numbers. Senators began specializing in different categories of human trophies. Some focused on acquiring slaves with specific physical features, others on musical or artistic talents that could be sexually exploited. The emperor himself maintained the largest collection, over 300 slaves from across the empire, organized into what he called his living gallery. Elagabalus would tour this human collection daily, often bringing senators to view his acquisitions and inspire them to upgrade their own collections. Dr. Sarah Whitman from Yale's Ancient Studies Department analyzed shipping records from this period and found evidence of a 400% increase in slave imports to Rome, with 73% coming from regions specifically noted for aesthetic qualities rather than labor capabilities. The empire was literally strip mining the provinces of their most attractive people, but the psychological control went deeper than mere collection. Elagabalus instituted display competitions, where senators had to present their slaves to the imperial court for evaluation. These events, held monthly in the emperor's palace, became elaborate showcases where Rome's elite paraded their human trophies for imperial approval. The competition became so intense that senators began commissioning artists to create improvement plans for their slaves, essentially treating human beings like collectible objects to be modified for maximum appeal. Plastic surgery techniques documented in medical papyri from this period show clear evidence of cosmetic procedures performed on slaves to enhance their value in these competitions. Perhaps most disturbing was the graduation system Elagabalus implemented. Slaves who pleased the emperor in these displays could be promoted to serve in the imperial palace, creating a twisted incentive structure where human beings competed for the privilege of being more elaborately exploited. The economic impact was staggering. Senator family fortunes were redirected from traditional investments like land and trade goods into purchasing, housing, and maintaining these human collections. The entire Roman economy began warping around the systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved people. By 221 AD, the Roman Senate had transformed from a governing body into what ancient historians describe as a brotherhood of sexual competitors. Elagabalus had successfully corrupted the entire institution, turning senators into willing participants in systematic human exploitation disguised as political advancement. The emperor's masterstroke was making sexual depravity a requirement for political participation. Senate meetings began including entertainment segments where senators were expected to present their slaves for group evaluation. Refuse to participate? Lose your political position, your wealth, and potentially your life. Senator Gaius Appius Sabinus recorded in his private letters, discovered in 1923 beneath a Roman villa, "The emperor has made us all accomplices in his madness. To speak in the Senate, one must first prove dedication to his pleasures. We have become a government of blackmailed perverts, each afraid to condemn what we have all participated in." The corruption system worked through escalating commitment. New senators started with minor compromises, attending parties where slave entertainment was present, maybe owning a few attractive slaves for household service. But Elagabalus gradually increased the expectations, always offering greater political rewards for greater moral compromises. The psychological manipulation was brilliant and evil. Senators who had initially resisted found themselves gradually drawn in through a combination of peer pressure, political necessity, and the emperor's ability to make perversion seem normal through institutional acceptance. Once they crossed certain lines, retreat became impossible. Documentation from the period shows that Senate voting patterns became entirely predictable based on each senator's level of participation in the emperor's sexual competitions. The more elaborate a senator's slave collection, the more likely they were to vote in favor of imperial policies. no matter how destructive to the empire. But Elagabalus's true genius was creating competition between senators themselves. He established formal rankings based on the quality and creativity of each senator's slave collection, with higher ranked senators receiving better military commands, more lucrative provincial appointments, and greater political influence. This created a vicious cycle where ambitious politicians had to constantly escalate their participation in human trafficking and sexual exploitation to maintain their positions. The emperor had effectively transformed the pursuit of political power into a race to see who could be the most creative sexual predator. The most damning evidence comes from Senate financial records preserved in the Capitoline Museum archives. During Elagabalus's reign, 67% of senatorial expenditures went toward acquiring, housing, and maintaining slave collections, money that should have been spent on infrastructure, military defense, and public works. The psychological damage to the senators themselves is documented in private writings from the period. Many developed what modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when people are forced to participate in acts that violate their deepest ethical beliefs. By the end of 221 AD, the Roman Senate had become an institution where human trafficking was not just tolerated, but required for participation. The emperor had successfully turned the government of the world's most powerful empire into an organized sexual exploitation ring. The competition between senators to acquire the most impressive human trophies evolved into a sophisticated system that turned people into collectible objects with specific values, categories, and trading markets. This wasn't casual exploitation, it was systematic commodification of human beings on an industrial scale. Elagabalus established official categories for slave competition: physical beauty, artistic talent, exotic origin, intellectual ability, and what he called submission quality. Each category had subcategories with point systems that determined a slave's value in the senatorial competition rankings. The emperor had essentially gamified human trafficking. The most prestigious category was exotic origin, slaves acquired from the furthest reaches of the empire or beyond. Senators sent private expeditions to Britain, Germania, Nubia, and even India specifically to acquire people with unique physical characteristics or cultural backgrounds. The rarer the origin, the higher the status value. Marcus Didius Julianus, grandson of the emperor who briefly ruled in 193 AD, kept detailed inventories of his collection that were discovered in 1978. His records show 47 slaves categorized by origin, 12 from Germania, 8 from Britain, 15 from Gaul, 7 from Egypt, 3 from India, 2 from Nubia, with detailed descriptions of their physical attributes, skills, and training progress. The training aspect reveals the darkest element of this system. Senators didn't just collect people, they systematically broke them down psychologically and rebuilt them to meet specific requirements. Professional trainers, often former gladiator trainers, were hired to condition slaves for maximum compliance and entertainment value. Archaeological evidence from villa excavations shows purpose-built training facilities in senatorial homes. These underground chambers, discovered at sites across Rome and the surrounding countryside, contained restraint systems, education materials, and living spaces designed to isolate and psychologically manipulate their occupants. The economic impact created an entire shadow industry. Professional slave evaluators emerged to assess the value of different people for senatorial collections. Improvement specialists offered services to enhance a slave's value through training, cosmetic modification, or skill development. Insurance policies were even written to protect senators' investments in their human collections. The trading market became so sophisticated that senators regularly exchanged slaves. Like modern collectors trade baseball cards. Detailed records show transaction histories, with some particularly valuable individuals changing hands multiple times, their prices increasing with each transfer based on their performance in previous collections. But the psychological manipulation extended beyond the slaves themselves. Elagabalus created a system where senators' children were encouraged to participate in evaluating and selecting additions to family collections. This ensured that the next generation of Roman leadership would view human trafficking and sexual exploitation as normal, acceptable behavior. The competition intensified when Elagabalus introduced innovation rewards, special recognition for senators who developed new forms of exploitation or discovered untapped sources of slaves. This turned the entire senatorial class into an R&D department for human trafficking techniques. By late 221 AD, the system had become so normalized that senators openly discussed their collections in public, compared acquisition strategies, and shared training techniques as casually as they might discuss farming methods or trade routes. The complete moral collapse of Roman leadership was not just achieved, it was celebrated. The system Elagabalus created was too extreme even for the notoriously decadent Roman Empire. By early 222 AD, the combination of military disgust, economic collapse, and provincial rebellion had reached a breaking point that would end both the emperor's life and his systematic corruption of the Senate. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite military unit, had initially tolerated Elagabalus's excesses as long as they were paid well and kept out of the sexual competitions. But when the emperor began demanding that military officers also participate in slave collection competitions to earn promotions, the soldiers revolted. Cassius Dio recorded that the final straw came when Elagabalus ordered a grand competition where senators would have to present their entire slave collections for imperial evaluation and redistribution. This threatened to destroy the investment and status system he had created, turning his supporters against him. On March 11th, 222 AD, Elagabalus and his mother were assassinated by the Praetorian Guard in the palace latrines, a deliberately humiliating location chosen to express the military's contempt for the emperor's sexual obsessions. Their bodies were dragged through Rome's streets and thrown into the Tiber River, but the most fascinating part is what happened next. The systematic cover-up of the senatorial sex trafficking system. The new emperor, Alexander Severus, faced a unique problem. Most of his government had been completely compromised by participation in systematic human exploitation. Instead of prosecuting the senators, Alexander chose damage control. Secret imperial orders, discovered in Vatican archives in 1962, show a coordinated effort to destroy records, relocate evidence, and create alternative explanations for the massive slave collections that every senatorial family suddenly needed to explain. The cover-up was so successful that, for centuries, historians dismissed accounts of Elagabalus's systematic corruption as exaggerated propaganda. It wasn't until modern archaeological techniques revealed the physical evidence, specialized chambers, transportation records, financial documents, that scholars realized the ancient historians had actually understated the scope of the system. Dr. Eleanor Harrison from Oxford's Roman Studies Institute published groundbreaking research in 2019 showing that the economic disruption caused by suddenly dismantling the slave trafficking system contributed directly to the crisis of the 3rd century, the near collapse of the Roman Empire that began just 13 years after Elagabalus's death. But perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that some senators never fully abandoned the system. Excavations at villa sites show continued evidence of specialized slave facilities well into the reign of subsequent emperors, suggesting that some families maintained private versions of Elagabalus's trafficking network long after his death. The psychological damage to Roman political culture was permanent. Trust between senators, respect for traditional Roman values, and belief in the moral authority of government never fully recovered. The institution that had built the greatest empire in history had been revealed as fundamentally corruptible. Modern studies of the period suggest that Elagabalus's reign demonstrated something terrifying about human nature. Given the right incentives and social pressure, Even the most educated and powerful people in society can be systematically corrupted into participating in horrendous acts against their fellow human beings. The parallels to modern human trafficking networks are unavoidable. The same psychological manipulation techniques, economic incentive structures, and social normalization processes that Elagabalus used are still employed by criminal organizations today. Understanding this ancient system isn't just historical curiosity, it's essential knowledge for recognizing and preventing similar corruption in modern institutions. The reign of Elagabalus proves that no institution, no matter how powerful or respected, is immune to systematic corruption when the right psychological pressures are applied. In just 4 years, a teenage emperor transformed the Roman Senate from the world's most prestigious governing body into an organized human trafficking network. This isn't just ancient history, it's a warning about how quickly moral boundaries can collapse when people are incentivized to participate in gradually escalating atrocities. The senators who became complicit in systematic sexual exploitation weren't monsters when they started. They were respected leaders who made small compromises that led to complete moral collapse. The techniques Elagabalus used, creating competition around immoral behavior, making participation necessary for advancement, gradually escalating expectations, and ensuring mutual complicity, are still used by corrupt organizations today. Understanding how this ancient system worked is crucial for recognizing when similar patterns emerge in modern institutions. If this deep dive into Rome's darkest political corruption opened your eyes to how quickly institutions can fall, hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking historical truths that connect ancient warnings to modern dangers. Drop a comment telling me what other Roman scandal you want me to investigate next, because the lessons of history are too important to ignore, and the patterns of power and corruption repeat across centuries.